So I will share my screen and I'll discuss points the second half of the lecture. I'll start the second half of the lecture. Sorry. So in the second half of the lecture, I will discuss law and legal precedents following the Gladue case. So the trials of Bradley Barton led the Supreme Court to pass new laws in Canada regarding the murder of Indigenous peoples, and specifically the murder of Indigenous women and girls. And so 718.201 and 718.04 uh, are sections that were added to the criminal code in 2019 to address the recommendations outlined in the inquiry's final report and concerns expressed by the Supreme Court of Canada in R versus Barton. And so these amendments or additions to the criminal code involve principles of public denunciation and deterrence. So, in instances where people are found guilty of killing Indigenous peoples and who are referred to in the law as vulnerable persons, and specifically these sections of the criminal code uh, state that if you are found guilty of murdering a vulnerable person, and particularly an Indigenous woman or girl, you your actions must be denounced and they must be deterred by other members of the public, meaning there must be public acts denouncing this kind of heinous violence and murder and gratuitous sexual violence against vulnerable persons, and specifically Indigenous women and girls. And there must be efforts to denounce this kind of public violence and also to deter members of the public from committing sexual violence against Indigenous peoples. So, Indigenous women and girls endure horrific rates of violence in Canada, influenced by factors such as the colonial legacies of the criminal justice system. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls outlined the extent of this massive harm and made recommendations to begin addressing the profound damage to Indigenous communities. In response, sections 718.04 and 718.201 were added to the Criminal Code in 2019. The Canadian government indicated in the legislative summary to the amendments that these provisions were added to address recommendations from the final report and concerns expressed by the Supreme Court of Canada in R versus Barton. So, Section 718.04 of Canada's Criminal Code mandates that the court's sentencing for offenses involving abuse of vulnerable individuals, bracket, especially Indigenous women, must prioritize denunciation and deterrence, focusing on societal condemnation and preventing future acts, often leading to harsher penalties, representing a key legal tool addressing systemic violence against women and girls in Canada. So the key aspects of Section 718.04 are vulnerable victims, which applies to offensive where the victim is vulnerable due to personal circumstances, including being Indigenous or female. Primary sentencing objectives, and this requires judges to give primary consideration to denunciation, which is society's condemnation, and deterrence, which is discouraging similar conduct. Origin is also central to Section 718.04 of the Criminal Code, introduced partly in response to recommendations from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Impact. This aims to send a strong message against such offenses, often resulting in increased sentences compared to cases without these specific considerations. So there is a tension with GLADU, and it creates a complex balancing act for judges who must weigh these specific victim-focused objectives against principles like GLADU that consider the systemic factors affecting Indigenous offenders. In essence, Section 718.04 ensures that when vulnerable individuals, particularly Indigenous women, are abused, the justice system prioritizes publicly condemning the act and deterring others rather than solely focusing on offender rehabilitation or background. So if Sherene Razack is correct to draw on Giorgio Agamben, and Indigenous women and girls could be referred to as homo sackers who can be reduced to bare life, then these additions to the criminal code are meant to address this failure of the criminal justice system, but also society and Canadian society, and even to address the world's failure to construct Indigenous people as those who are deserving of rights, or as German Jewish intellectual Hannah Arendt comments on, people who have the right to have rights. So in the essay, We Refugees, written after the Holocaust, Hannah Arendt refers to Jewish people as those who have the right to have rights, meaning the right to have statehood. And so in cases where Indigenous women and girls are killed with impunity, reduced to bare life, in many instances, uh, in cases where the media uses images of supposed addiction or mental health or crime or deviant behavior to justify the murder of Indigenous peoples, they are constructed as stateless people. And this statelessness does make sense if we think about settler Canada and Canadian nation building as an effort to destroy, defame, and to murder, remove Indigenous peoples from land. And this kind of violence against Indigenous peoples exists throughout the world, including in India, where the Adivasi people are routinely raped by the Indian military, um, defending their right to land and their right to their ancestral land. So this specific hatred of Indigenous women and girls is also possible because it means that future children will not be born. And this is also evinced in ongoing class action lawsuits, which I'll discuss next week, that have been filed against nurses in Canada who are accused of burning the tubes and forcibly sterilizing Indigenous women who have one child. So forcible tubal ligation has been going on in Canada's healthcare system for many decades. Canadian jurisprudence has a history of not taking the protection of women and girls seriously. Historically, the fact that an offense took place in the context of domestic violence was sometimes treated as a mitigating factor at sentencing. Courts prioritize the, quote, reconciliation of spouses, even in the context of serious domestic violence. In some cases, a victim's decision to forgive or remain with her abuser was treated as a mitigating factor. Lenient sentences were justified on the basis of avoiding negative impacts on the marriage between the victim and offender or preventing the accused from blaming his sentence on the victim, even, even when even where the victim was severely injured in front of their children. In extreme cases, in extreme cases, Domestic violence was trivialized entirely, such as in R versus Acorn, where the accused received a suspended sentence for a violent assault on his spouse, with the condition that he buy her a $50 present. So Canada's criminal justice system has a long history of abusing women and of punishing women who try to leave abusive relationships, including work relationships and romantic relationships, familial relationships with men. Indigenous women are particularly vulnerable due to the legacy of colonialism and related policies and both individual and systemic racism. This has resulted in higher rates of criminal victimization. For example, statistics from 2019 indicate that 8.4% of Indigenous people were victims of sexual assault, robbery, or physical assault, compared to 4.2% of non-Indigenous people. Nearly 1 in 10 Indigenous people surveyed reported being the victim of a violent crime in 2019 alone, versus approximately 1 in 12 and 25 non-Indigenous people. Additionally, 26% of Indigenous women reported experiencing sexual violence during childhood, nearly 3 times the rate reported by non-Indigenous women. So, systemic discrimination begins with the failure of every institution to take a person's rights to have rights, as Hannah Arendt discussed in relation to Jewish people after the Holocaust, seriously. So Arendt argued that Jewish people were stateless people, but they still had the rights to have rights somewhere in the world. And these statistics, including child sexual abuse, and abuse throughout the whole course of one's the whole course of one's life, perhaps construct Indigenous women and girls as people who have the right to have rights, but do not have rights that are exalted or taken seriously. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report also cited a lack of research on the effects of S. S. S.718-2E of the Criminal Code on the safety of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people, and Indigenous communities, stating that the current sentencing practices in Canada are not enhancing the safety of these groups or their communities. So among the recommendations were 517, we call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to thoroughly evaluate the impacts of Gladue principles and Section 718.2E of the Criminal Code on sentencing equity as it relates to violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. We call upon the federal government to consider violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people as an aggravating factor at sentencing and to amend the criminal code accordingly with the passage and enactment of Bill S-215.34. These legislative recommendations were identified by the Canadian federal government for legislative action. So the government is called upon to uphold these sections of the criminal code. And there is obviously a gap, as many feminist jurisprudence scholars or scholars of gendered jurisprudence or people who study jurisprudence from a feminist perspective often discuss this gap between the written word of the law and the application of the law. And this has been true in cases such as the Barton case, because Bradley Barton was, of course, acquitted the first time, and the case had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. And this happened after many years of protest, of hashtag campaigns like Justice for Cindy and petitions, media cases, public demonstrations. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd by the US police was is also an example of the gap between the letter of the law and the actual upholding of the law, specifically in cases where the victims of crime are minorities, are oppressed peoples, are people who are not thought of as having the position of the ruling class, who can think, who can feel, whose minds are taken seriously. So in Barton, the Supreme Court of Canada made a strong statement about the detrimental effects that widespread widespread racism against Indigenous people has had on the criminal justice system and on Indigenous people in Canada. Justice Moldover, writing for the majority, referred to the recommendations of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and stated, Indigenous persons have suffered a long history of colonialism, the effects of which continue to be felt. There is no denying that Indigenous people, and in particular Indigenous women, girls, and sex workers, have endured serious injustices, including high rates of sexual violence against women. Among among its recommendations, the court emphasized the need for jury instructions designed to dispel harmful assumptions about Indigenous women who perform sex work. The decision also calls on the criminal justice system and all justice system participants to address systemic biases, prejudices, and stereotypes against Indigenous persons, and in particular Indigenous women and sex workers head on. So the Barton case then did have an effect at the Supreme Court level in that it did lead to legal precedents. And these legal precedents involve additions to the criminal code that um, ask judges to deter further crimes against vulnerable persons and specifically Indigenous women and girls, and to deter the public. And this can be done through media cases. It can be done through education. There are many ways in which the public can be called upon to denounce violence against Indigenous women and girls. And there are many ways that younger generations of people can be deterred in committing these acts. And this could be harsh sentencing of those who are convicted of murdering Indigenous women and girls. It could also be monetary compensation or fines for the victims' families. So the law also is really specific about crimes specifically that are evidence or examples of intersections of racial discrimination and gender-based discrimination. So Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black feminist, discusses intersectionality. Intersectionality is a popular term in the liberal arts and humanities, and it refers to the intersections of sexism and racism, classism, religious violence that all kind of intersect in these instances of violence against Indigenous women and girls. So the law and the changes to the criminal code take intersectionality into account. And the law states that many of the crimes committed against Indigenous women are perpetrated by Indigenous men. A significant portion of the jurisprudence in these cases concentrates on how to arrive at a fit sentence while balancing consideration of the accused as an Indigenous offender with the need to protect Indigenous women and girls. Section 718.2E of the Criminal Code creates a statutory duty that the court considers the particular circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. As articulated in R versus Apili, failure to apply Gladu in any case involving an Aboriginal offender runs afoul of this statutory obligation. As these reasons have explained, such a failure would also result in a sentence that was not fit and was not consistent with the fundamental principle of proportionality. Therefore, application of the Gladue principle is required in every case involving an Aboriginal offender, and a failure to do so constitutes an error justifying appellate intervention. So, Section 17.2e then discusses cases where Indigenous men commit crimes against Indigenous women. And so the Gladue principles then create similar statutory obligations that require courts to consider the circumstances of the victim and the community. And so, in cases where Indigenous men uh, murder or rape or commit crimes against Indigenous women, the history of colonialism is what judges must consider because colonialism did not treat settler colonialism and colonial law, including the Indian Act, did not treat Indigenous women and Indigenous men in the same manner. So while Indigenous men and women bear the burdens of colonialism, the harms of sexual violence are overwhelmingly borne by women, and in particular, Indigenous women. And the Indian Act actually sought to discriminate against Indigenous women who tried to marry non-Indigenous men. And the Indian Act also discriminated against Indigenous women who were not allowed to have title to land irrespective of pre-colonial cultures of matrifocality and matriarchy and matrilineal lineages. So, as I've discussed, the mugshot posters are an example of the ways that prior to the Gladue precedent, judges were not really instructed to denounce and deter these crimes against Indigenous women and girls in the Canadian media. And so now at the federal level, the Supreme Court level, judges are now going to have the power to denounce and deter these cases and to turn to Canadian media uh, to denounce and deter these instances of the murder of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So the media has in Canada has been deemed to play a central role historically and now in the devaluation and the construction of Indigenous women and girls as disposable. The criminalization of Indigenous women and girls has been discussed by many authors who have talked about these mugshot photos that you see after Indigenous women and girls go missing and die. So there are these posters, which are kind of like wanted posters of for criminals, and there are posters of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. But the way that the photos are taken obviously make it seem as though these women and girls were criminals. And this kind of criminalizing of the dead or the missing obviously has a form of expedient or is obviously a form of expediency in terms of labor and class antagonism in the sense that if one can prove or if one believes that a murder victim was a criminal, then you do not really have to spend a great deal of money prosecuting their case or even looking for them. So if these women are thought to be quote native girls or quote native prostitutes, then if they go missing or are murdered, they can be deemed to be criminals, and this means that the police do not have to look for them, the general public does not have to engage in any activism, and courts of law do not have to take their status as missing or murdered people seriously. And this was the same in cases, and it has been the same in cases of anti-Black racism and police murder of Black North Americans and Europeans who are often thought of as being criminals after they die. And this allows the state to kill people with impunity and then to not have to pay for any investigation into their deaths. This is obviously why the law has changed and these legal changes have been made, and 718 has been added to the Canadian Criminal Code, and judges are now being called upon to enter into a dialogue with the public or to promote public awareness of these cases, and to deter the general public from killing or defaming or devaluing the lives of Indigenous women and girls. Um, Heavy fines and financial penalties, I think, should be and can be a central part in the sentencing of those who are found to degrade, demoralize, and murder Indigenous women and girls. So the third point I'll discuss is eugenics and biopolitics. So Michel Foucault is a famous queer scholar whose work, The History of Sexuality, is well cited in queer theory and theories of sexuality. And Foucault was also interested in the prison industrial complex, the insane asylum, and all of these institutions that sought to discipline and normalize bodies. And Michel Foucault was queer in a time when it was not legal to be queer, and in a time in Europe where religious marriages were common, including forced religious marriages. And so for Foucault, biopolitics refers to the administration of life. And Michel Foucault was interested in the ways that the state intervenes into the administration of life. So, nutritional warnings on water bottles or food packages that indicates that something has 50 milligrams of calcium or 4% of sodium. And this is the kind of warning that one would see on, say, anything and everything that one buys, including water bottles. All things that you buy in Canada have these nutritional warnings. So this is obviously a positive way in which the state intervenes into our lives. So if you go somewhere else, or even if you buy things that are not, say, Canadian, like street foods, for example, or if you go to other countries and buy street food, you might end up with a stomach ache, or you might end up not knowing what it is that you are eating because there are no nutritional warnings. So the state intervenes into our lives in order to prolong our lives. And this is also about warnings on alcohol packages, or if you buy bottles of alcohol, there can be warnings on the packaging. Warnings on cigarette packs are an obvious example. There are these really extreme photos or kind of uh, the visual depiction on cigarette packs are really supposed to depict death from smoking and painful death. And so this is a way that the state is trying to keep us alive. However, what interests Foucault is that this kind of biopolitics, this administration of life, also involves administrating against others. So the banning of abortion throughout many states in the United States of America by Michael Dobbs, and the legal precedent is Dobbs versus Jackson Health Center. And so in this ruling, the Dobbs precedent has banned abortion throughout many states in the United States of America. And so this is obviously negative biopolitics. Life is administered against, in the sense that women's lives can be made precarious. And I believe in pro-choice, so I would argue that this has a detrimental effect on women's rights to have rights and their rights to have bodily integrity and control over their own sexuality. So it is possible that someone could die because they cannot have an abortion, and they cannot also afford to fly to New York or to other states where they can get an abortion. So the use of these photos of Cindy Gladue smoking is a form of biopolitics. So Michel Foucault differentiates between biopolitics and biopower. So biopolitics is the kind of overarching program that the state has in regards to smoking. Biopower are the techniques that the state uses to discourage people from smoking, like putting warnings on these packages of cigarettes, having an unsmoke hotline. But this kind of biopower is also about the history of the tobacco trade in Canada and its relationship to Indigenous peoples. It is also obviously about deeming certain people who are working class, who might be sex workers, or who might be precariously employed or poor or working class people. It is about deeming these people to be kind of negative or bad or deviant people by constructing smoking as being a kind of evil or heinous behavior and one that could kill someone. Cindy Gladue did not die from smoking. Cindy Gladue died when Bradley Barton, a white man, inserted a knife into her vagina and she bled to death in an Edmonton motel room. Cindy Gladue had had a sexual relationship with Bradley Barton, and Bradley Barton consented to having a sexual relationship with Cindy Gladue, and then he did murder Cindy Gladue. So, um, she did not die from smoking, and he has been found guilty. And yes, he has appealed, but in the eyes of the law in the Canadian Supreme Court ruling, he is guilty. And no, she is not guilty for smoking. The tobacco industry has a long history in Canada, and it is a legal industry. Canada legally sells cigarettes. The Canadian government makes a huge revenue from the sale of tobacco and also marijuana. Judith Butler discusses the concept of grievability. Judith Butler importantly questions who can I become in such a world where the meaning and limits of the subject are set out in advance for me. And in Judith Butler's work, The Force of Nonviolence, Butler actively suggests that we must advocate for nonviolence. And Judith Butler draws on the writings of Mahatma Gandhi to argue that even in instances where we are victims of extreme cruelty, we can turn to non-violent principles. Butler engages with Foucault and discusses the the desubjugation of the subject, where he examines how the normalization process determines the constraints on all forms of social identity, and how even in the most emancipatory acts of self-identity, constraints always dictate the extent and intensity of these identities. Subjectivity is determined by social limits, including the compelling limit of ugliness. So this kind of degrading of the body of humanity is the way that someone loses subjectivity, loses what Butler calls qualified recognition, where subjectivity is based on understanding the particular limits of what it means to be human, and by extension that when certain individuals are labeled as less than human, that qualified recognition allows for a suspension of their subjectivity. Within qualified recognition, individuals who surpass the social limits and enter into ugliness are placed within this less than human subjectivity and face massive social marginalization and prejudice as a result. Within the colonial project, the centrality of the human subject is essential. The human subject of the colonial project, the colonizer, is desirable, rational, productive, and independent. The human subject embodies the goals, priorities of the colonial project. So this kind of constant narrative of Indigenous women as being addicts or as being people who drink too much alcohol and are not allowed to, I guess, smoke and drink, are not allowed to have sex, are not allowed to fail in any way, and are not allowed to have children because they are not perfect people, is obviously a dehumanizing. So many people in Canada smoke and drink, including white settlers and especially white men. If you look at statistics, people who smoke and drink and make the most mistakes and obviously commit the most crimes in Canada are white people, and yes, white men. And so this kind of construction of this person, Cindy Gladue, and other Indigenous women as being those who are not human or deserve to die because they are not kind of people who can ever reach the the pinnacle of the exalted subject because they are not white and must overperform some sort of health program or capitalist program in order to be a kind of model minority and enter humanity is a form of subjection and a form of dehumanizing of Indigenous peoples. So within sexist and racist discourse and within colonial discourse, it is only kind of the smallest percent or the talented tenth of the population of any group of colonized peoples who is allowed to be seen as fully human, the most beautiful, a genius, an athlete, a real hero can enter into this kind of zone of whiteness, into this kind of reign of supremacy. And Cindy Gladue, I guess, smoked. And so there's no sympathy for her, even when the knife went into the vagina. So Catherine Morton, in this chapter, in the book *The Politics of Ugliness*, draws on Judith Butler to discuss the limits of the human. The human subject within colonialism is deeply racialized, and colonized people are routinely deemed less than human and more animalistic than the colonizer. So even Cindy Gladue, I guess, having sex and smoking and not having a lot of money is depicted as kind of monstrous. And then we come back to the silent sleeper in the Barton case, which is Barton himself, a murderer. So Cindy Gladue is a quote, native prostitute. Cindy Gladue is a quote, native girl. The girlhood is kind of animalism. It's childish, infantile. The prostitution means she is outside of a rational kind of labor contract. But then we get to Bradley Barton, who is never referred to as, quote, a white man, quote, a white trucker, quote, a white guy who took a knife and inserted it into a woman's vagina and left her to bleed to death. So this is obviously animalistic behavior. As Butler suggests, even the label of human has deeply racist elements to it, with different non-white races being placed in a descending chain from the pinnacle of humanity, embodied in white subjects, and is what Sunira Tabani has referred to, exalted subjects, subjects who are exalted above Indigenous peoples and people of color. Butler determines that being labeled as less than human or as other amounts to rendering someone socially undesirable for the purposes of this chapter ugly, in that they do not conform to either the aesthetic or behavioral expectations of the dominant majority. The conflation between ugliness and being less than human allows for the power inequality between colonizer and colonized bodies to hold and preserve into present times. So if we return to the smokes, I mean, Cindy Gladue, the way that the photo is framed, the cigarette is kind of part of her body. Like in many photos, when people smoke, say people in bands or anyone has ever smoked, they try to kind of show that, like, often the photo is the person hiding the cigarette behind their back or holding the cigarette. But her actually having the cigarette to her mouth, it's almost so part of her body. And so the addiction is then part of her body, but it is also interesting to think about this in relation to the trade of tobacco and settler colonialism, and who profited from the trade of tobacco and who spread the trade of tobacco and the sale of alcohol for their own financial purposes. And the answer is obviously settler colonizers. So if you look at the names of tobacco companies like De Maurier, Belmont. These people were obviously are people who profited financially and who become part of the ruling class through the sale of tobacco and then control our ideas about tobacco and who can and cannot smoke. So Sarah Jessica Parker smoking in Sex and the City is somehow fashionable. It's an elite thing. It's Parisian. But this woman, Cindy Gladue smoking, is seen to be is coded as being deviant behavior. So Sarah Ahmed talks about the ways that whiteness functions as a form of public comfort by allowing bodies to extend into spaces that have already taken their shape. Those spaces are lived as comfortable as they allow bodies to fit in. The surfaces of social space are already impressed upon by the shape of such bodies. If whiteness gains currency by going unnoticed, then what does it mean to notice whiteness? Sorry, there's a typo here. White should be what? Then what does it notice? Then what does it mean? What? No, then what does it mean to notice whiteness? So Sarah Ahmed is interested in the ways that bodies gain comfort. And so in a court of law, Cindy Gladue is a quote native girl or quote native prostitute. Using these terms when someone's mother is present and someone's children are present in a court of law obviously creates a great deal of discomfort. The court of law is not a space for Indigenous peoples, but Bradley Barton is never referred to as, quote, a white working class man, quote, a white trucker, quote, a man who cheated on his spouse or who committed acts of infidelity. Bradley Barton is never referred to as, quote, a pathological criminal or a white man. So, not naming whiteness is the way that whiteness gains its currency. It's how white people become comfortable in certain spaces. Because to name whiteness as pathological, as murderous, as deviant, as degenerate, would cause white people to feel discomfort. And so the space of the court of law was a space where Bradley Barton could not be named as a white man and was therefore comforted in his unmarked privilege. In the politics of performance, Peggy Phelan states that there is no more powerful position in the world than being unmarked. To be unmarked means to be remarkable. Or sorry, it means to be unremarkable. And being remarkable might be thought of as a good thing. So being remarkably beautiful or remarkably athletic might be thought of as being a good thing. But Phelan argues that when one is remarkable, they stand out. And when someone stands out, they could stand out and be celebrated in the ways that celebrities are or sports players. But they could also stand out in the way that someone stands out and could be shot by the police. Ahmed discusses whiteness in relation to phenomenology. So, phenomenology is a theory that was first discussed or written about by Merleau-Ponty, or one of the first people to kind of make phenomenology famous was Merleau-Ponty. And Ponty was interested in the ways that experience, smell, sight, touch, taste are central to our experience of life. So Ponty wanted to move away from a philosophical tradition that thought about life in relation to rational ideas, that we formulate ideas in our minds. We think of things and then we do these things and then we experience what we have thought of. So I decide to do something and I experience my idea. No, phenomenology means that I decide to go for a walk and I will go for a walk um, after I have recorded this lecture and I will experience the weather of where I am. And I will experience the noise of where I am. And I'll experience the time of day of where I am. And so this is actually how philosophy comes to fruition, that philosophy isn't disembodied. We smell, we touch, we see. And so Sarah Ahmed draws on phenomenology to discuss whiteness. It is important to remember that whiteness is not reducible to white skin or even to something we can have or be, even if we pass through whiteness. When we talk about a sea of whiteness or white space, we are talking about the repetition of the passing by of some bodies and not others for sure. But non-white bodies do inhabit white spaces. We know this. Such bodies are made invisible when we see spaces as being white, at the same time as they become hyper-visible when they do not pass, which means they stand out and stand apart. You learn to fade into the background, but sometimes you can't or you don't. And so this kind of comfort of the body in space is also about skin color. And many scholars, like French scholar Didier, discusses the skin ego and the ways that how our skin feels in certain spaces, how we are looked at, how we are spoken of, the names we are given, or the names that are ascribed to our skin in certain contexts or places, frame our actual ego or our psyche. And Ahmed wants to argue that our feelings, our senses, how we feel comfort, how we uh, perceive of reality can be shaped also by race and by intersections of gender, sexuality. Jawani comments that Indigenous women are largely portrayed as abject victims of poverty, their lives marked by alcohol and drug addictions, homelessness, high infant mortality and morbidity rates, greater instances of HIV, hepatitis, infections, and gynecological cancers. In effect, they are represented as one of the most hopeless segments of society. There is a common treatment within the visual discourse of missing and murdered Indigenous women that establishes Indigenous women as the most helpless and vulnerable marginalized population. Anderson and Robertson comment that through the visual discourse, the press tells stories of violence against Indigenous women by constructing them as weak, backward, sexualized objects, anonymous, replaceable bodies. So the replaceability will again take us back to the Feuerbach and Marx, who argued that there is a difference between base and superstructure, those who labor with the body and those who produce ideas, who can think, whose class position means that they're thinking, feeling people, which means that their minds matter. Their names are names. They are not just mass, and they are not just disposable people and disposable labor. So I'll discuss the forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls and the forced tubal ligations that have gone on in Canada and the healthcare system for many decades next week. And I will finish by discussing bare life. So finally, I want to finish again by discussing bare life in detail. And I will post these slides online. And the quotes are taken from the lectures, and some of them are taken from secondary sources, such as the writing of Michel Foucault and Maurizio Lazzarato, who is a scholar who writes after Foucault specifically about biopolitics. So finally, bare life, Giorgio Agamben, disposability, and the sovereign. So Razack then, as I mentioned, refers to Agamben. And Razack states that referencing Giorgio Agamben's notion of naked or bare life, homo sacer, life that Agamben describes as a life that does not deserve to be lived, Kana points out that the inhabitants of concentration and detention camps in Agamben's work are people kept out of the polis. Integrated as a disposable class within a war economy and marked for sexual disposability, the harlots that Timur disposes of do not fit easily into Agamben's concept of bare life. They are inside the polis. However, their status is nevertheless the status of those marked for disposability. So, what interests Razack, or the question that Razack's work poses, is whether or not Indigenous peoples can be thought of as homo sackers when they are not geographically outside of the polis. So Agamben is interested then in how homo suckers, or really people who live on the fringes of society, and the example of refugees is the one that Agamben uses. And this is why Agamben is interested in this figure of the homo sucker, which goes back to a different time of the aristocracy, that people could be pushed out of the kingdom. And when subjects can be pushed outside of the kingdom, they can be made into stateless people. And what interests Agamben is how this happens when someone is a refugee, that they are pushed literally outside of the kingdom. And even when you think about someone being deported, they cannot retain citizenship. And in many cases, someone who is jailed could just be a stateless person. So if you tried to seek asylum or if you tried to stay in a country, you could be found to be an undocumented or non-status migrant, and you could be put in jail, and then you are stateless. But what Razack wants to ask is whether Indigenous peoples could be thought of as stateless, even when they exist in the polis. And the example is the case of Cindy Gladue, who was not thought of as a Cree person or even as a Canadian person or a Canadian woman, but quote a native girl and quote a native prostitute over 50 times in a court of law. And then the general public and the feminist movement, the queer movement, uh, Indigenous peoples, not only in Canada, but in Australia, New Zealand, around the world, have to protest for years so Bradley Barton can be tried at the Supreme Court level. And he was finally found guilty after a decade of lawsuits and protests and petitions and appeals and protests and petitions. So I will play this clip about homo soccer.
Step forward into a bold new era where data, analytics.
Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about Giorgio Agamben's idea or notion of homo sacer. Now, before jumping into that, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guigno. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to help you along your philosophical journey. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to see you back. If you want to help me out, you can do that by simply subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your friends, commenting, all that stuff. We got to pump that algorithm a little bit. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the video on YouTube. If you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find this in podcast form anywhere where you get podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads, at least for now. If you are listening to this in podcast form, perhaps on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars would help me out a lot. And yeah, you can help me out via Patreon or PayPal if you want to, but obviously no pressure. And I don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's talk about homo sacer, which is a complicated term, and I want to be quite upfront. I'm not going to be able to discuss every single part of this, especially the history of the term that Agamben is drawing from. You really have to read the entire book, homo sacer, or sacer, whatever, for that. I'm just going to give you kind of a bare bones understanding of it to get your feet off the ground, essentially, and open up some possible criticisms I have of it and some of the ways that it informs perhaps Foucauldian notions of biopolitics or works against them to some extent as well. So let's jump into it. Now, at the core of the term homo sacer is a kind of ambivalence. And the reason that there's an ambivalence is because sacer quite literally can refer to sacred. And when we think of sacred, we probably think someone who's exalted, maybe they're held in high esteem. But the tradition and the language, etymologically, that Agamben is drawing from actually paints the notion of sacredness or sacer in this way in a kind of negative light as well, where someone who was considered to be sacred or sacer was someone that could also be seen as being like dirty, like someone you weren't supposed to come in contact with, someone that could actually be like ostracized from the political order. Now, the reason he's digging into this question of sacredness is because, and he's really speaking to Walter Benjamin here, and the kind of question that Walter Benjamin opens about the sacredness of life in relation to divine law and what divine law might mean. And I've done an episode on Benjamin's text, The Critique of Violence, which you can find and check out on here if you want. But Agamben is really curious about this because there's been a kind of naive assumption that sacredness, is referring to something that is held in high esteem, something that is seen as being something to protect. Now, Agamben shows, because it is also associated with this kind of notion of being dirty, this image of dirtiness, that they are someone who has to be excluded. Now, that serves a very instrumental function for Agamben in constituting a political order, but we're gonna get there in a minute. We're gonna build here and arrive to that point. But that is essentially the end goal that Agamben wants to arrive at. So homo sacer is a person, is a human, who is both beneath the law and outside of the law. That is, they are someone whose life can't be used to propitiate, which is a fancy word for saying that cannot feed or cannot be sacrificed is someone whose life can't mean anything really for those people in authority, for the dominant social order. So, for example, they are so beneath life, they're so beneath citizenship, let's say, especially as we're referring to this in relation to the Roman tradition that he's really picking up on here, and the Greeks as well. Homo sacer is someone who is beneath citizenship, and so their life means nothing in terms of a sacrificial order. So you cannot sacrifice a Homo sacer with the hope of getting something from the gods, like have your crops grow or something like that. They are seen as being less than that. At the same time, they are also someone whose life means nothing even if they're killed. So if you were to kill one of these people, or if they were to be killed, what that would mean was that nothing would befall you because it was like you weren't even killing a human. So their lives couldn't be sacrificed to the gods, and their lives meant like nothing within the political order, which is very strange considering our perhaps immediate understanding of what a sacred person is. But historically, as Agamben shows, they are someone whose life could neither be used to propitiate the gods, nor could be seen as being something worth defending or punishing if they were to be killed by someone else. So the person who killed them couldn't be punished. Now, the emergence of this kind of figure, this person that can be killed with impunity, essentially, where nothing bad will happen, can only come about in a certain phase, a certain stage, a certain kind of mode of social organization, one that Agamben attributes specifically to the emergence of sovereign power, because it is the sovereign who has the capacity to kill without that killing being in the service of anything so-called meaningful in terms of a sacrificial order, or the killing being something that could then be retribution can be paid for it in the form of disciplinary measures or whatever. So the sovereign is the person who is given the potential, given the, I guess, authority to kill without committing homicide, and to, in that same act of killing, do it without it meaning anything in a sacrificial way. Because in the case of like a sacrifice, that person would hardly, the executioner, would hardly be someone considered to have committed a homicide, because it is part of that social order as being something that is approved, allowed for. Now in this phase, because, or this kind of mode of social organization, in this social sphere, people are viewed as being less than, these specific people are viewed as being less than worthy to sacrifice, and so they can be killed with impunity. Now, at this point, they are reduced to what Agamben calls, and what he draws from etymologically, they are reduced to a kind of bare life, where all they are is a living being. And because they are only a living being, they're just flesh, essentially, they don't actually have any real meaning, and so they can be killed with absolutely no consequence. And so even though a person is held as being sacred, and we know now that that sacredness is not something to really be excited about, it serves a pretty instrumental function in that it is a necessary part of the establishment of sovereign power. So in that sense, it is kind of sacred. It's a necessary component and something we must strive for if we want to establish this kind of social organization, which is obviously not a great one. But these people are held in a kind of strange inverse exaltation where they are seen as being a necessary component of this system, precisely because they can be taken out of that system via killing without any kind of repercussions. Now, this is how Agamben establishes his own form of biopolitics, where people are reduced to a kind of life only. And it is in that moment that they can then be killed without any kind of repercussions occurring. Now, this is both similar and different from the kind of biopolitics we get in Foucault, because Foucault doesn't pay quite as much attention to this possibility of death coming from this focus on life. In fact, he considers more about what the proliferation of life means in terms of power. Whereas Agamben is saying this proliferation of life, this acknowledgement of things as life, has pretty negative consequences, because then it strips people of anything beyond their flesh, because it strips them of anything beyond their zoe, being the term he draws upon here, anything other than just their lifeness. They don't have any kind of meaning beyond that. And that's a very scary moment because it reduces people to that just their biology, which houses no meaning in itself. Now, he uses the example of the Holocaust to also illustrate this, where the Jewish people, among other people at the time, were reduced to this kind of bare life. They had their rights taken, citizenship taken, everything like that, and reduced to only life. And he calls this a form of biopolitics in that way. And he says that obviously opened the door for this thing called the Holocaust, for that event that is still very much unimaginable that yet that still occurred. Now, there's an issue that I have with this, just to give my own input, in that he reduces the Holocaust to like a kind of teleological inevitability to this thing called sovereign power and bare life. And while that may be true, in that we have certainly set the conditions for these types of events to occur, and they have occurred all across the world in terms of as a result of this kind of sovereign power that he sketches, I think that he is too quick not to see the specificity of an event like the Holocaust as representing something more than just a kind of teleological consequence of this form of sovereign power, in that there were so many other historical situations that played a part, like the historical treatment of Jewish people certainly contributed to this. It wasn't just any people, and we can't lose sight of that fact. Like the treatment of the Jewish people all throughout the world for thousands of years contributed to this as well. This is not just the demonstration of a kind of sovereign power that did this because it could. It was a sovereign power that also had these other baked in prejudices. And I think that Agamben downplays that to some extent. And that is really it. There's, to give you a kind of basic introduction, there's not really much more to add than that. But of course, you get a lot more if you actually read the text. But yeah, if anyone, you listen this far, I'd love to hear what anyone else had to say, what you think might be worth adding. If anyone puts a comment in that's really good, I love pinning them, so that everyone can see anything that should be added. Or if I mischaracterized anything, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, if you like what I did here, leave 5 stars, like, share, review, and catch you next time. Take care.
So, um,
Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about the distinction and disagreements between Giorgio Agamben and Michel Foucault.
You can look at this channel called Theory and Philosophy, and it's right here on YouTube. It's David Guignon's channel called Theory and Philosophy, and there are a lot of useful videos. So next week, I will discuss visual representation in the Gladue case in more detail. And I will also discuss um, the other article from next week as well on the syllabus. So I'll finish with a quote from Marx. And the class will discuss many theoretical and philosophical traditions, but a lot of feminist and queer and anti-racist theory would be referred to as neo-Marxist theory. So Marxism begins with this critique of injustice and inequality that is rooted in class hierarchy. And neo-Marxism, feminist theory, queer theory, critical race theory, discusses the kind of nuances of this injustice. So I will finish with a quote from Marx, and I will post these slides online. And please email me if you have any questions or concerns. As Marx states, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Thank you very much, and I hope you are doing well.